The Palace of Laratil rose above the city like a frozen wave, its pale towers bending in smooth arcs that seemed grown rather than built. At certain hours of the day, the walls absorbed sunlight and released it slowly, so that the entire structure glowed with a quiet, breathing radiance. Travelers approaching from orbit often mistook it for a natural formation until their sensors detected corridors, chambers, and the faint movement of thousands of lives inside. Private Nathan Hale still had not grown used to it. He stood near one of the open balconies, watching the distant traffic lanes where cargo skimmers drifted between floating platforms. The air carried a faint metallic sweetness, a scent produced by the palace's atmospheric regulators. To Nathan, it always smelled like someone had tried to make oxygen taste polite. "Do humans always stare at buildings as if they might apologize to you?" a voice asked behind him. Nathan turned and saw Queen Veyra approaching, her steps measured but unceremonious, as if she had long ago grown tired of the rituals that followed her everywhere. She looked almost human at first glance. Calm face, steady gray eyes, but her long, elegant ears swept back along her hair, catching the light like thin crescents of ivory. "Only the ones who are afraid the building might fall on them," Nathan said. "I like to establish a respectful relationship with architecture." Vera regarded him for a moment, then let out a quiet laugh. It was a rare sound, soft but genuine. "You believe the palace is dangerous?" "I believe anything taller than a mountain and older than my species probably has opinions." They began walking along the balcony. Below them, terraces descended in wide steps, filled with gardens that shimmered faintly as bioluminescent leaves adjusted to the afternoon light. Small maintenance drones moved between the plants, humming in tones so gentle they sounded almost like insects. Nathan had been stationed here for 3 months as a liaison between the Terran Union and Vera's court, though most days he felt less like a diplomat and more like a mildly confused tourist who had accidentally been given security clearance. Court life moved at a pace he could never predict. Some days passed in endless meetings, where scholars debated energy taxation across 3-star systems, while other days were spent watching ceremonial performances that seemed to last longer than human winters. Nathan had once timed a single welcoming ritual and discovered it ran for 4 hours and 20 minutes, not counting the speeches about why the ritual was shorter than it used to be. He had made the mistake of mentioning this aloud. The archivist responsible for historical ceremonies had spoken to him for 2 straight hours about the philosophical meaning of duration. Nathan still wasn't sure how he survived that conversation. "Captain Girath tells me you refused a formal escort again," Veyra said. "I didn't refuse. I negotiated. I said 1 guard instead of 6. That is still refusal." "That is compromise," Nathan replied. "If I walk around with 6 armored giants behind me, I feel like I'm being arrested very politely." Veyra smiled faintly but said nothing more. She seemed thoughtful, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where storm clouds gathered in slow violet spirals. Weather control satellites were already adjusting pressure gradients to disperse them, but on this world the atmosphere often resisted such interference, as if it preferred its own moods. They entered an interior corridor where the walls shifted color in response to movement, glowing warmer as they passed. The palace was partly alive, grown from engineered materials that responded to heat, pressure, and sound. Nathan sometimes wondered whether the building listened to conversations and formed opinions about its inhabitants. If so, he hoped it had a sense of humor. At the far end of the corridor, a small figure appeared, running at full speed and ignoring every rule of decorum in the process. Princess Mira skidded to a halt in front of them, slightly out of breath, her long ears tilted backward in concentration as she held something in her hands. "Nathan," she said, "it stopped ticking again." He crouched to examine the object, a mechanical watch, old even by human standards, its brass casing scratched from years of use. Mir had been fascinated by it since the day he arrived. "It's not broken," Nathan said. "You just have to wind it." She watched closely as he turned the small crown. The faint ticking resumed, steady and comforting. "It sounds like a tiny machine heart," Mira said. "That's exactly what it is." She considered this seriously. "Then it must be very brave." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Why brave?" "Because it keeps going even when no one is looking at it." Nathan opened his mouth to reply, then closed it again. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or salute the watch. Mira looked up at her mother. Can I show Nathan the observatory later? The new telescope can see the rings of Kereth in daylight. Veyra nodded. If he agrees. Nathan sighed dramatically. I suppose I can endure looking at one of the most beautiful astronomical instruments in the quadrant. Mira grinned. You complain a lot for someone who always says yes. I complain because it improves the experience. They walked together through the palace, their footsteps echoing softly. Servants and guards bowed as the queen passed, but the atmosphere felt calm, almost peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, musicians were rehearsing, their instruments producing tones that vibrated faintly through the walls. Nathan found himself relaxing, thinking that perhaps the palace was not so intimidating after all. It was in many ways simply a home, large, complicated, and occasionally absurd, but still a place where people lived their lives. As they reached the central atrium, a faint tremor passed through the floor, so slight Nathan might have imagined it. Veyra paused. Did you feel that? Nathan asked. Yes, she said quietly. For a moment, nothing happened. The palace lights remained steady, the distant music continued, and the air smelled as it always did. Clean, faintly sweet, entirely ordinary. Then somewhere far below, a deep, muffled sound echoed upward, like the distant roar of something awakening. The sound did not repeat immediately. For several seconds, the palace seemed to hold its breath, as if the vast structure itself were listening. Nathan glanced upward, half expecting the ceiling to announce something in a calm, administrative voice. The palace systems often spoke, usually to remind inhabitants about temperature adjustments or scheduled gravity shifts in the outer towers. But this time, there was only silence. Then the floor trembled again, slightly stronger. Princess Mira looked from her mother to Nathan. Was that the reactor gardens? Veyra did not answer at once. Her expression had changed, not to fear, but to calculation. It came from below the eastern wing, she said quietly. A low chime sounded in the air, not the sharp alarm of danger, but a soft preliminary tone, the sort used when a system detected irregularities but had not yet decided whether to panic. Nathan folded his arms. That's either very reassuring or deeply unsettling. What do you mean? Mira asked. If a machine isn't sure whether we're in danger, it means someone programmed it to hesitate. Mira considered this and nodded gravely, as if this were a profound philosophical truth. A guard approached at a brisk but controlled pace, armor whispering softly as its adaptive plates shifted with each step. Your Majesty, engineering reports a thermal fluctuation in the lower conduits. Containment fields are stabilizing. Nathan relaxed slightly. Thermal fluctuations sounded manageable, the kind of problem solved by technicians with tools and mild frustration. Veyra inclined her head. Keep me informed. The guard departed. Mira exhaled. So nothing is wrong. Nathan looked at the distant ceiling. I wouldn't say nothing. Buildings don't usually growl for entertainment. They resumed walking, though the atmosphere had changed subtly. Conversations in the corridors were quieter. Servitors moved a little faster. Somewhere, unseen systems adjusted ventilation, producing a faint current of cooler air that brushed against Nathan's face. They reached the observatory, a circular chamber whose transparent dome opened onto the pale sky. Suspended in the center was the new telescope Mira had mentioned, a delicate structure of silver rings and crystalline lenses that shifted alignment with silent precision. Mira ran ahead to the control pedestal. Look, she said, tapping a panel. The dome polarized instantly, revealing the faint outline of a distant ringed planet even in daylight, its pale bands shimmering like a ghost in the blue sky. Nathan leaned closer. I'll admit it, that's impressive. You always admit it, Mira said. Yes, but I try to sound reluctant. It builds character. She laughed. For a few minutes, the tremor was forgotten. Mira explained how the telescope compensated for atmospheric distortion, speaking with the enthusiasm of someone who had listened very carefully to her tutors and intended to repeat everything she remembered. Nathan listened, nodding seriously, though he understood perhaps half of it. So the lens array bends neutrino scatter? I'm going to stop you right there, Nathan said gently. If you say neutrino again, I will have to pretend I understand, and that could embarrass both of us. Mira giggled. Another tremor interrupted them, sharper this time. The floor vibrated, and a faint, distant thud echoed through the palace, followed by a sound like rushing wind. The lights dimmed for half a second, then returned. Nathan straightened. All right, that one sounded less polite. The observatory doors slid open and Captain Giraffe entered, his expression tense. Your Majesty, the fluctuation has intensified. A plasma conduit in the eastern sublevels has ruptured. Fire suppression systems are deploying. Fire? Mira said. Giraffe hesitated, glancing at her before answering. Contained fire. Nathan noticed the way he emphasized the word contained, as if saying it firmly enough might make it true. Veyra stepped toward him. Evacuation protocols? Not yet, Your Majesty. The engineers believe they can isolate the damage. As if in contradiction, a faint smell reached them then. Sharp, acrid, unmistakable. Smoke. Nathan sniffed the air. That doesn't smell contained. A distant alarm began to sound, this time sharper, more urgent. The tone echoed through the corridors in steady pulses. Mira's eyes widened. That's the real alarm. Joreth touched the communicator at his collar, listening to rapid transmissions. His expression darkened. The fire is spreading along the maintenance shafts. Ventilation systems are carrying heat into the eastern residential levels. Veyra's voice was calm but firm. Begin evacuation of the eastern wing immediately. Giraffe bowed and turned to issue orders. The palace lighting shifted to emergency mode, corridors glowing in cool white lines that indicated evacuation routes. Doors opened automatically, and a distant murmur of movement began as staff and residents followed the illuminated paths. Nathan felt a strange, tightening sensation in his chest. Not panic, not yet, but the awareness that events were accelerating beyond anyone's control. Mira stood very still, clutching the mechanical watch in her hand. Will the palace burn? She asked quietly. Nathan crouched beside her. Palaces are stubborn, he said. They don't like burning. Too much paperwork afterward. She gave a small, uncertain smile. Another tremor shook the structure, stronger than before. Somewhere far below, a deep, roaring sound echoed upward, no longer distant, no longer ignorable. Heat began to creep into the air, subtle but unmistakable. Nathan looked toward the corridor, where a faint orange glow now flickered at the far end, reflecting off polished walls. The fire was no longer somewhere else. It was coming. The evacuation corridors filled quickly but not chaotically. The palace had been designed for emergencies long before Nathan had been born, and its systems guided movement with quiet authority. Lines of light along the floor shifted direction, doors opened and sealed in careful sequence, and calm recorded voices repeated instructions in several languages. Despite that, the air was growing warmer. Nathan walked beside Mira and Queen Veyra, keeping pace with the flow of servants, engineers, and guards moving toward the central transit lifts. The usual sounds of the palace, music, conversation, distant machinery, had been replaced by the steady pulse of alarms and the faint hiss of pressure seals activating in distant sections. Is it normal for evacuation routes to feel like a festival queue? Nathan muttered, glancing at the long line ahead. Mira looked up at him. What's a festival? It's where humans gather in large groups, eat too much, and complain about waiting in lines. That sounds inefficient, she said. It's extremely inefficient, Nathan agreed. That's why we enjoy it. Even Veyra allowed herself a faint smile, though her attention remained fixed ahead. They reached one of the main transit lifts, a wide circular platform designed to descend directly to the evacuation docks. People stepped aboard in steady groups, disappearing downward into the depths of the structure. Captain Giraffe approached again, his armor marked with faint soot now. Your Majesty, the eastern wing is being sealed. Fire suppression has slowed the spread, but the containment fields are fluctuating. Fluctuating, Nathan said. That sounds like a polite way of saying losing. Joreth did not answer, which was answer enough. Another tremor shook the corridor, stronger than the last. Somewhere far away, a deep cracking sound echoed, followed by a rush of air as pressure doors slammed shut. Mira flinched. Nathan rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. Just the palace clearing its throat, he said. Very large buildings get dramatic when they're upset. She looked at him skeptically. You're making that up. Yes, he admitted, but it sounded convincing for a moment, didn't it? They boarded the lift. As it descended, Nathan felt the temperature drop slightly, the ventilation systems pushing cooler air upward from lower levels that had not yet been affected. Through the transparent barrier around the platform, he could see shafts of orange light flickering in distant corridors where automated fire barriers were deploying, curtains of shimmering energy designed to slow heat and flame. The technology was impressive. The fire, apparently, was more so. At the evacuation docks, organized teams guided people toward waiting transport craft. The cavernous chamber echoed with voices, footsteps, and the distant hum of engines warming for departure. Outside the massive docking gates, the city shimmered beneath the afternoon sky, unaware or unconcerned with the disaster unfolding above it. Veyra turned to Jarath. Ensure all residential levels are cleared. They are being checked now, Your Majesty. Nathan noticed the way the captain said it, not with certainty, but with professional caution. Being checked was not the same as cleared. Mira was watching the transports, her expression subdued. Do we have to leave the palace? She asked. For a little while, Veyra said gently, until it is safe. Nathan leaned against a railing, exhaling slowly. The tension in the air was thick but controlled. People were moving efficiently, the guards directing traffic with practiced precision. It felt, he thought, like a situation that was still manageable. Then a new alarm began to sound, louder, sharper, cutting through every other noise in the chamber. Jarath stiffened, touching his communicator. The color drained slightly from his face as he listened. What is it? Veyra asked. The eastern residential level. He hesitated. A section did not evacuate in time. Structural damage has blocked the primary corridors. Nathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. How many people? Unknown. We are still confirming. Veyra's voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it now. Send rescue teams. They are attempting entry, Jarath said, but the heat levels are rising rapidly. Nathan looked toward the upper levels, far above the docks, where faint smoke now drifted along the ceiling vents. A technician hurried past them, speaking urgently into a headset. Somewhere, a transport engine roared to life, the sound echoing like distant thunder. Mira tugged at Nathan's sleeve. My rooms are in the eastern level. He looked down at her. Were, he said gently. You're here now. She hesitated. My star charts, and the watch tools, and... Her voice faltered. Veyra knelt beside her daughter. Objects can be replaced, she said softly. You cannot. Mira nodded, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Nathan looked again toward the upper levels. The smoke was thicker now, curling along the high arches of the docking chamber ceiling. Another tremor shook the structure, followed by a distant, thunderous crash that echoed through the metal and stone like a giant's footstep. Everyone in the chamber fell silent for a moment. Nathan swallowed. That didn't sound like a small problem. Jarath lowered his hand from his communicator slowly. A secondary containment field has failed, he said quietly. The fire is spreading into the upper residential corridors. Nathan felt the weight of those words settle in his chest, heavy and cold. Above them, far beyond the docks, the palace was beginning to burn in earnest. The docking chamber was no longer calm. It was not chaos yet, but the careful rhythm of evacuation had begun to fracture. Voices were louder, footsteps faster, and the distant thunder of collapsing structures echoed at irregular intervals through the palace's immense frame. Nathan stood near the railing, staring upward into the vast vertical shafts that connected the docks to the residential levels. Smoke drifted downward in slow gray ribbons, caught in the currents of the ventilation systems. The smell was stronger now, burned insulation, heated alloys, something sharp and bitter that stung the throat. Captain Jarath spoke rapidly with a group of officers, projecting a three-dimensional map in the air. Sections of the palace glowed in shifting colors. Green for safe, amber for unstable, red for lost. The red areas were spreading. Nathan leaned closer, squinting at the map. I don't suppose there's a color for maybe fine if we all pretend hard enough. One of the officers glanced at him, clearly unsure whether he was serious. "I'm joking," Nathan said. "Mostly." Jorath ignored the comment. Rescue teams Alpha and Delta attempted entry through Corridor 16. Structural collapse blocked both routes, heat levels exceeding operational limits. Queen Veyra stood silently, watching the map. Her face remained composed, but her long ears were angled slightly backward, a subtle sign of tension Nathan had begun to recognize. "Continue attempts," she said. "There may still be survivors." "Yes, Your Majesty." Mira stood beside her mother, clutching the mechanical watch in both hands as if it were a talisman. Nathan noticed she kept glancing toward the lifts, toward the upper levels, as if expecting someone to appear. He crouched beside her. "You're thinking about your rooms again." She nodded faintly. "Well," Nathan said, "if the fire doesn't destroy them, I promise to personally rescue every book, chart, and mysterious object you've hidden under the bed." "I don't hide things under the bed," she said automatically. "Everyone hides things under the bed." "Do humans do that?" "Constantly, usually socks." She frowned. "Why socks?" "No one knows. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries of our civilization." For a moment she smiled, and Nathan felt a quiet sense of relief at seeing it. Then Jorath's voice cut through the air again, sharper now. "Wait, repeat that." He turned away, listening to his communicator. His expression changed, tightening. "What is it?" Veyra asked. "There is still one life sign in the eastern residential level," Jorath said. "A small one. The signal is intermittent, but consistent." Nathan felt a sudden chill. Mira looked up. "A child?" Jorath hesitated. "Possibly." Veyra's voice was steady but urgent. "Location?" The map shifted, zooming inward to a cluster of chambers deep within the burning wing. Several corridors leading to that area were already marked in red. "Access routes?" Veyra asked. "None that are safe," Jorath said. "The nearest intact corridor is unstable. Temperatures are rising too quickly. Rescue teams cannot reach it in time." Silence fell around them, heavy and suffocating. Nathan stared at the map, one small blinking point, surrounded by expanding red. "How long?" he asked quietly. Jorath did not look at him. "Minutes." The words seemed to hang in the air, enormous and final. Mira's grip on the watch tightened. "You have to help them," she whispered. No one answered. Officers exchanged glances, speaking in low voices about probabilities, about structural forecasts, about heat tolerance thresholds and evacuation priorities. Every sentence sounded reasonable. Every conclusion sounded inevitable. Nathan felt something hard and cold forming in his chest, a quiet, rising anger that surprised even him. He looked again at the blinking point on the map. "Where exactly is that room?" he asked. Jorath frowned. "Why?" "Because I asked." The captain hesitated, then pointed. "Sector E19, residential quarters." Nathan nodded slowly, memorizing the layout, the corridors, the intersections. He had walked those halls many times, escorting Mira back from lessons or wandering aimlessly when he couldn't sleep. He knew the way. "You cannot be thinking—" Jorath began. Nathan was already turning toward the lift shafts. "Private Nathan," Veyra said. He stopped and looked back at her. Her expression was unreadable. "The heat levels are lethal," she said quietly. "I know. You are not trained for fire rescue." "I know. You are not required to do this." Nathan shrugged slightly. "That's usually when things that matter happen." Jorath stepped forward. "This is not courage, it is recklessness." Nathan met his gaze. "Maybe, but standing here and watching a child die feels worse." No one spoke. Another distant crash echoed through the palace, the sound of something vast giving way. The alarms pulsed, louder now, more urgent. Nathan turned back toward the lift shafts. "Private Nathan," Mira said softly. He glanced over his shoulder. "Please be careful," she said. He gave her a small smile. "I always am." "That's not true," she said. "No," he admitted. "It isn't." He stepped onto the ascending lift platform before anyone could stop him. As it began to rise, the docking chamber fell away beneath him, the air growing warmer with every meter. Smoke drifted past in slow, swirling currents, illuminated by the harsh white emergency lights. Nathan exhaled slowly, steadying his breathing. Well, he muttered to himself, this is either a very brave decision or a very stupid one. The lift continued upward, carrying him toward the fire. The lift slowed as it reached the upper levels, then stopped with a muted chime that sounded almost apologetic. When the doors slid open, heat poured in like a living thing. Nathan stepped out and immediately felt sweat form along his neck. The corridor ahead was hazy with smoke. The lighting dimmed to a dull orange as emergency systems struggled to compensate. Somewhere far away, metal groaned and snapped, the sounds echoing through the structure in long, trembling waves. Well, Nathan muttered, this officially qualifies as a bad day. He pulled a cloth from his pocket and tied it loosely over his mouth, more for comfort than real protection, and began moving down the corridor. The palace no longer felt like the serene, intelligent structure he had known. The walls flickered, their responsive surfaces failing to maintain color. Panels hung open where maintenance drones had attempted repairs and then retreated. A faint, unnatural wind moved through the passage, drawn by pressure differences as sections sealed themselves off. Nathan tried to remember the layout. Sector E-19. Two main corridors, one branching gallery, then the residential chambers. He turned left, coughing as the smoke thickened. A small maintenance drone rolled past him at high speed, its sensor array flickering wildly. It stopped, turned in a small circle as if confused, then sped away again. Good luck to you too, Nathan said. He reached an intersection and paused, listening. The fire made a sound unlike anything he had ever heard. Not a single roar, but 1,000 small, crackling whispers layered together, punctuated by the occasional deep, thunderous collapse. He moved forward. Heat radiated from the walls now, making the air shimmer. A section of ceiling ahead had partially collapsed, scattering fragments of crystalline alloy across the floor. Nathan climbed over them carefully, trying not to think about how much weight those fragments represented. At the next corridor, he hesitated. Left or right? The map in his memory felt blurred now, distorted by stress and smoke. He closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to breathe slowly. Mira's voice came back to him, laughing as she ran ahead of him weeks earlier, pointing toward her quarters and explaining the murals on the walls. Left. He turned left. A moment later, he nearly slipped on the polished floor, now slick with condensation from emergency cooling systems. Catching himself against the wall, he shook his head. If I survive this, he muttered, I am filing a complaint about the floors. A loud crack echoed behind him, followed by a rush of air as another section of the palace sealed itself. The pressure wave pushed him forward a step, nearly knocking him off balance. Noted, he said to no one. The building objects to complaints. The smoke was thicker here, stinging his eyes. He could feel the heat pressing against his skin, draining his strength with every step. He forced himself to keep moving, counting his breaths, focusing on the rhythm of his footsteps. Then he heard it, a faint sound, almost lost in the crackle of flames. A cough. Nathan stopped, listening. There it was again, weak, uneven, but unmistakable. Hello? He called, his voice rough. No answer, only the distant roar of fire. He followed the sound down a side corridor, stepping over fallen panels and ducking beneath a sagging support beam. At the end of the passage, a door stood half open, its surface blackened by heat. Nathan pushed it wider. Princess Mira sat on the floor beside a low table, her face pale, her eyes red from smoke. The room behind her was dim but not yet burning, the walls shimmering as emergency barriers struggled to hold back the heat from the adjoining chambers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mira blinked, as if not quite believing what she saw. Nathan. Hi, he said hoarsely. I was in the neighborhood. She tried to stand but staggered, and he crossed the room quickly, steadying her. I thought everyone left, she said. They tried, he replied gently. You must have been missed in the confusion. I fell asleep, she said faintly. I was reading, and then the alarm started, and the corridors were full of smoke. Nathan glanced around the room. A small window showed only swirling gray outside. The air was already too hot. We have to go, he said. Mira nodded, gripping his arm. They stepped into the corridor, and the heat struck them immediately, stronger than before. Flames licked along the far wall now, spreading in slow, hungry lines. Nathan pulled the cloth tighter over his mouth and guided Mira forward, keeping her close to the cooler side of the passage. "Is it far?" she asked. "Not far," he said. This was not entirely true. They moved slowly, the smoke making every breath an effort. Twice Nathan had to stop to clear debris from their path, lifting fragments of collapsed paneling that felt heavier with every passing minute. At one intersection, a section of ceiling collapsed behind them with a deafening crash, sending a wave of heat rolling down the corridor. Mira flinched, clutching his arm. "That," Nathan said between breaths, "was the palace expressing disapproval." She managed a weak laugh. They reached the main corridor at last, but the route they had taken earlier was now blocked by fire, a wall of flames stretching from floor to ceiling. Nathan stared at it, his mind racing. There had to be another way. He forced himself to think, to remember the layout, the maintenance passages Mira had once shown him while proudly explaining secret shortcuts she had discovered. "This way," he said, turning toward a narrow service corridor, half hidden behind a maintenance panel. They squeezed through, the passage barely wide enough to walk side by side. The air here was cooler, the walls vibrating faintly with the flow of coolant lines behind them. Nathan exhaled in relief. "Remind me to thank whoever built this." "What will you say?" Mira asked weakly. "I'll say they saved us from a very unpleasant afternoon." They continued forward, the faint glow of emergency lights guiding their steps, the distant roar of the fire following them like a pursuing storm. The service corridor narrowed further as they moved, the walls close enough that Nathan could feel the vibration of coolant rushing through hidden conduits. The air was cooler here, but it carried a faint chemical tang that made his throat itch. Somewhere far behind them, the fire roared like a distant storm, growing louder, closer, relentless. Mira stumbled, and Nathan tightened his grip on her hand. "Easy," he said. "We're not racing anyone." "It feels like we are," she whispered. "That's just the fire being impatient." They continued forward, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined passage. The emergency lights flickered, dimmed, then steadied again, as if the palace itself were struggling to stay awake. After several minutes, the corridor opened into a small maintenance junction. Pipes and control panels lined the walls, their displays flashing warnings in several languages. One panel sparked, showering tiny white flashes onto the floor before going dark. Nathan studied the intersection, trying to orient himself. The service routes twisted in ways that ignored the logical geometry of the main halls. He rubbed soot from his eyes and forced himself to think. "Which way?" Mira asked. Nathan pointed left. "I think that leads toward the main transit shaft." "You think?" "I am moderately confident." "What does moderately mean?" "It means I will apologize later if I'm wrong." She gave a tired laugh, and they turned left. The passage sloped upward, growing warmer with every step. The fire was spreading faster than he had hoped. The distant roar had deepened, punctuated now by sharp cracking sounds that made the walls tremble. At one bend, they found the corridor partially collapsed. A support beam had fallen across the passage, leaving only a narrow gap beneath it. Nathan crouched, studying it. The beam glowed faintly with heat. "This," he said, "is what engineers call inconvenient." He lay flat and slid beneath it, the heat pressing against his back. On the other side, he turned and helped Mira through, shielding her with his arms so she wouldn't touch the metal. They continued on, both breathing harder now, the smoke seeping even into the service passages. Nathan's legs felt heavy, each step requiring effort. He focused on small things to keep moving, the rhythm of his breathing, the sound of Mira's footsteps, the faint hum of the palace systems still struggling to function. Finally, the corridor ended at a sealed door. Beyond it lay the main transit shaft. He was almost certain. He pressed the control panel. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, harder. Still nothing. "Come on," he muttered. "This is not the time for a union break." He pried open the panel with his fingers, exposing the manual override. The mechanism was stiff, but after several seconds of straining, it clicked, and the door slid open a few centimeters with a grinding sound. Hot air rushed in, thick with smoke. Nathan forced the door wider, coughing as the heat struck him. Beyond lay the transit shaft, a vast vertical space lit by the flicker of distant flames. The lift platforms were gone. lowered to the evacuation docks, leaving only emergency ladders and narrow maintenance walkways clinging to the walls. Mira looked up, her face pale. "We have to climb?" Nathan followed her gaze. The distance down seemed enormous, disappearing into smoke and shadow. "Yes," he said quietly. They stepped onto the metal walkway. The railing was warm to the touch, and the air shimmered with rising heat. Somewhere above, a section of the shaft groaned, metal warping under stress. Nathan tested the ladder. It held. "I'll go first," he said. "You follow me, slowly." They began to descend. The climb was slow and exhausting. Nathan's arms burned with effort, his lungs aching from the heat and smoke. He counted each rung to keep his mind focused. At one point, Mira slipped slightly, and his heart lurched, but she caught herself and continued. "You're doing great," he said. "I'm never climbing anything again," she replied faintly. "That's a reasonable life decision." Halfway down, a deafening crack echoed above them. Nathan looked up just in time to see a section of the upper walkway collapse, fragments tumbling past them into the smoky depths below. Mira froze. "Keep moving," Nathan said gently but firmly. "Don't look up. Just keep moving." They descended faster now, urgency pushing aside exhaustion. The heat lessened slightly as they neared the lower levels, though the air was still thick and heavy. At last they reached the bottom and stepped onto solid floor. Nathan leaned against the wall, breathing hard. His hands were shaking, though he barely noticed. "We made it," Mira said softly. "Almost," he corrected. "We still have to get to the docks." They moved through the lower corridors, guided by the emergency lights. The air here was clearer, though the distant roar of the fire still echoed through the structure, like thunder rolling through mountains. As they turned the final corner, the wide doors of the docking chamber came into view. Guards and technicians stood there, staring in disbelief. For a moment, no one moved. Then Captain Joreth ran forward, his composure breaking for the first time. "They're alive," he said, almost to himself. Nathan managed a tired smile. "Hello, Captain." Mira's mother reached them a second later, and the relief in her eyes was deeper than any words could have carried. Nathan felt his strength finally give way. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fire drained suddenly, leaving only exhaustion. He sank to one knee, still coughing, still smiling faintly. "Well," he murmured, "that was an adventure I would not recommend." The palace burned for 3 days. From the evacuation platforms in the lower city, Nathan watched the upper towers of Lurit glow red against the night sky, smoke rising in vast spirals that caught the starlight. Fire suppression ships drifted around the structure like slow, patient insects, projecting containment fields and streams of coolant that turned to glittering vapor before they reached the hottest sections. On the 4th day, the flames began to die. Nathan sat on a medical cot in one of the temporary command pavilions, his arm wrapped in a regeneration bandage that hummed faintly as it accelerated healing. Across from him, Mira sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully winding the mechanical watch again and again, as if reassuring herself that steady ticking still existed in the universe. "You're going to wear it out," Nathan said. "It's impossible," she replied. "You said it was stubborn." "That's true," he admitted, "but even stubborn things appreciate occasional rest." She looked up at him. "Are you going to leave now?" Nathan hesitated. The question lingered in the quiet air. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I was supposed to be a liaison, not a professional firefighter." "You were terrible at being a firefighter," she said solemnly. Nathan blinked. "I was." "You didn't even have equipment." He laughed, then winced as the motion pulled at his bandages. "That's fair criticism." Outside the pavilion, reconstruction had already begun. The palace's living architecture responded to damage by growing temporary supports, pale structures rising slowly like frost spreading across glass. Engineers and drones moved among the ruins, scanning, repairing, rebuilding. Life, Nathan thought, was stubborn too. Later that day, he was summoned to a temporary audience chamber, a circular hall assembled from modular panels, simple but dignified. Queen Veyra stood near a wide window overlooking the city. The faint light of the setting sun outlined her figure, and for the first time Nathan noticed how tired she looked. "You wish to see me, Your Majesty?" he said. She turned toward him. Yes. For a moment she said nothing, studying him with that steady, thoughtful gaze he had come to recognize. My guards, she said at last, are trained from childhood. They are strong, disciplined, and loyal. Yet when the fire came, many of them hesitated. They calculated, they assessed, they waited for certainty. Nathan shifted slightly. That sounds reasonable. It sounds safe, she replied, and safety has its place. But courage is something different. She stepped closer. You acted without certainty, without orders, without even a proper plan. Nathan shrugged. I had a plan. You did? Yes. Step 1, find Mira. Step 2, leave before burning to death. It was a simple plan. Veyra laughed softly, the sound carrying both amusement and something deeper, something like gratitude that still had not faded. I intend to change the way my guard is trained, she said. Skill and discipline will remain. But from now on, we will teach something else as well. The responsibility to act when others freeze. Nathan was quiet for a moment. That sounds like a difficult lesson. Yes, she said, but necessary. She paused, then added, I would ask you to remain here for a time, not as a hero, not as a symbol, simply as yourself. Nathan rubbed the back of his neck. I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach anyone anything. You already have, she said. He did not know how to answer that, so he simply nodded. Weeks passed. The palace began to rise again, its damaged towers reshaped into new forms that gleamed in the sunlight. Some scars remained, dark lines in the pale surfaces, but no one tried to hide them. They had become part of the structure's history. Nathan found himself settling into a new rhythm. He still attended council sessions, still wandered corridors that seemed determined to rearrange themselves overnight, still made quiet jokes that confused half the guards and amused the other half. But something had changed in him. Before, he had felt like an outsider observing a world that was not his own. Now, when he walked through the gardens or stood beneath the vast arches of the rebuilt halls, he felt a quiet sense of belonging, not because he was important, but because he had chosen to stay. One evening, as the sun set behind the city, Mira found him on the balcony where they had once watched the traffic lanes together. The palace looks different, she said. It does, Nathan agreed. Stronger, I think. Do you think it remembers the fire? Nathan looked at the glowing walls, at the faint lines where new structures had grown over old wounds. Yes, he said. I think it does. Mira wound the watch and held it up to her ear, listening to the steady ticking. It keeps going, she said. It does, Nathan replied. They stood there in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared, shining above the rebuilt towers of Laerthiel. The air was cool, the city quiet, and the palace, scarred, changed, but unbroken, breathed softly around them. And for the first time since the fire, everything felt at peace.